Wind power has been promoted as the cheapest form of renewable energy, much cleaner and greener as an alternative to burning coal to provide electricity, and it's considered vital to the Gillard government's promise to reduce or produce 20% of Australia's entire electricity supply from renewable energy resources by 2020. So, already, more than 1,000 wind turbines, some nearly as tall as the Sydney Harbour Bridge, are dotting the landscape of around 50 of the windiest parts of regional Australia, with many more planned. Some affected communities, though, aren't happy, and at public meetings in regional Victoria tonight and tomorrow night, residents will gather to discuss whether the giant turbines present a health risk, as opponents claim. We'll discuss that with our Tuesday panel shortly, but firstly, let me introduce to you Bernie Janssen, who's a resident of Wowbra, near Ballarat in Victoria. That's home to the third largest wind farm in Australia. Welcome to the show, Bernie.
Hi, Waleed. How are you?
I'm very well. How long have you been living near a wind farm?
Well, the wind farm moved in 3 years ago, so became fully operational in July 2009.
And how far away are you from the turbines?
We are 3.385 kilometres from the turbines, but so we're on the northern edge of the Wowbra wind farm, and we've got 128 turbines to our southwest. Okay,
so over 3 k's away. What impact are you saying that it's had on your health, if any?
Well, I mean, I think the thing is that where there has been significant impact on my health and on our neighbours' health. I can think of at least 60 people in the area where, you know, people complain about the noise and the sleep disruption. I think the major thing we can talk about is sleep disruption, but other sorts of effects are headaches. There is tinnitus, high blood pressure, tachycardia. There's what else is there? There's quite lots of really strange, weird feelings, joint ache, head pressure, ear pressure.
How can you be confident that that's all related to the presence of wind farms?
Okay, well, they weren't there before, and I know that you then say, well, that's that is not necessarily a cause and effect. But the thing that we were not against wind farms, and we're still not against wind farms. What we are saying is, right from the very beginning, we were absolutely supportive of the Wowbra wind farm. We continue to be supportive of renewable energy. And what we're saying is that these effects began before I even knew that the wind farm was operative. So it was like May, June, I'd say about June 2009, I started having, waking in the night. I'd never woken in the night with rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath. And so this happened over a month. Went to the doctors, high blood pressure, hadn't had high blood pressure before, went then to, he sent me immediately to a cardiologist, and then that whole process, when we went through that process, the doctor says, no, there's nothing wrong with your heart. We started looking at other options. We started talking to our neighbours and discovered that within the last couple of months, many of our neighbours were beginning to experience exactly the same symptoms. Okay. And then we began to talk to people across the world and discovered that people across the world are experiencing the same symptoms.
Okay, good to get your account, Bernie. Thanks for talking to us.
That's okay.
Bernie Janssen, a resident of Wowbra near Ballarat in Victoria, with her account of what it's like to live near a wind farm and attributing obviously those effects to the presence of that wind farm. So let's pick up this question now with our Tuesday panel. Dr. Sarah Laurie is the Chief Executive Officer of the Wowbra Foundation. It's an organisation concerned about the health impacts of wind turbines. And Professor Simon Chapman is a Professor of Public Health at the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney. Both of you, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Wally.
Thanks, Wally.
Sarah, I'll start with you. You know the Wowbra community. Are there lots of people like Bernie?
There are. Well, yes, there are, Wally.
How many?
Look, I haven't interviewed everybody, but I'm aware of at least 30 people who've contacted me or have been put in touch with me, and I'm aware that there's plenty of others who are telling their neighbours that they're also getting the same pattern of symptoms which relate to the exposure to operating wind turbines. So when the wind is blowing in a different direction or when the turbines aren't turning, people are fine. When they're away from the turbines, they don't get the symptoms. It's when they're home or in their workplace and the turbines are turning and they're getting either an upwind or a downwind effect that they get these symptoms.
So we can be absolutely confident, in your view, that there is a causal relationship between the presence of wind farms and these results?
Yes, absolutely. We don't fully understand exactly what it is, but the acousticians that I'm working with are now measuring infrasound and low-frequency noise, which has certainly been known to cause these symptoms elsewhere from other sources of industrial noise. So things like heating and cooling ventilation systems, large compressors, many other sources of industrial noise, and those symptoms have been shown for a number of years to be causally related to these specific noise frequencies. We don't actually have much data at all about exactly what the acoustic emissions are that people are exposed to, and so that's one of the things that the Wahlberg Foundation are working with independent acousticians who are out in the field gathering this sort of data.
Well, when you say there's evidence, I mean, the reason I've been asking these questions is because according to the National Health and Medical Research Council, there is no published scientific evidence to support adverse effects of wind turbines on health. So how do you account for that?
Look, I think there's some crucial studies that the NHMRC didn't include in their literature review, which relate to industrial noise from other sources. They're quite right when they say that there is not the evidence concerning noise emissions from wind turbines, because somewhat surprisingly, given that these problems have been around for nearly 10 years in Europe and the UK and in Australia, the most basic of research has not yet been done, and it needs to be, and that's what the Wahlberg Foundation are calling for. We're saying we need to get out in the field, measure the acoustic emissions that people are exposed to inside their homes and in their workplaces, and also start collecting the clinical data to see what the effects are.
Okay. Professor Simon Chapman, you've been listening to all of this.
I have, Wallen, yeah.
And I imagine you've got a very different take on it. What are your responses?
Well, let's start by saying that this is not the first time in history of medicine that new technologies which have been introduced have been accompanied by claims of adverse health effects. I was looking at something in the British Medical Journal from 1889 the other day, and it was talking about a disease called neurasthenia. And the writer, who was a medical person, was saying that it was caused by wireless telegraphy, science, steam power, newspapers, and the education of women.
Right.
So, and I'm old enough to remember that when televisions first came on, people would say, "Oh, I wouldn't have one of those in the house. They emit rays." And then we heard it about electric blankets, and we heard it about microwave ovens, and we've heard it more recently about mobile telephone towers, and we're starting to hear it about Wi-Fi. And now, in some parts of the world, and they emphasise some parts of the world, we're hearing a crescendo of complaints about wind turbines. Wind turbines, Sarah said a minute ago, the first complaints started happening about 10 years ago, but the fact is that wind turbines have been up in their hundreds and hundreds in different parts of the world for a lot longer than 10 years. And so the interesting question arises, why did these complaints start arising about 10 years ago? And they started in Wales, as far as I'm aware, with one GP reporting, and there'd been a wind farm opened up in onshore in the United Kingdom about 10 years before that with no complaints.
Are you saying there's no difference between the wind farms that existed more than 10 years ago and the ones
of course they're bigger today than they were, but I haven't heard the complaint that it's only the new ones. I'm sure we'll get that soon. But what a lot of people are saying about this is that we're probably seeing what's known as something called the Nocebo Effect. Everyone's heard of the placebo effect, where you're given something and told that this is going to make you better, and you go, "Wow, doc, I feel a lot better now that I've taken that pill." And what it turns out to be is a sugar pill. Nocebo Effect works in the opposite direction, where people run around saying, look, these turbines, they've got these sort of sound waves coming out of them that you can't hear them, but by crikey, they're going to make you ill. And it's no surprise that when, people like Sarah Laurie move into town and start sort of, ringing doorbells and asking people, have they got high blood pressure? Well, 40% of the community's got high blood pressure. Sleep problems, a hell of a lot of people have sleep problems and wake up in the middle of the night at different times. Tinnitus, very, very common problems, that sort of thing. To attribute them all to wind turbines is something which I think anyone with any degree of scientific imagination and training would look at and see, well, there's a lot more to this than we're being told.
Okay, Sarah Laurie, is it possible here that we're just relying on anecdotal accounts of the way people feel and then drawing conclusions that are not really supported by evidence?
Look, Walid, I'd just like to comment on a couple of things that Simon said. Firstly, the larger turbines are emitting more low-frequency noise. Now, that has been peer-reviewed, published evidence that was put out last year by Professor Moller, who's a Danish acoustician who I have worked with, and he found that the larger turbines, more powerful ones, do emit more low-frequency noise, and it's the low-frequency noise and the infrasound that we believe is causing the problems, and there's some preliminary data that's been collected that is confirming that. So that's number one. The larger turbines do seem to be more of a problem.
But just on that point, are the complaints of the health effects that people are making, are they confined only to the larger wind turbines, or are they being extended to smaller ones that have existed prior to the last 10 years as well?
There's people in Australia who live next to smaller turbines at Crookwell and Windy Hill in Queensland that I'm familiar with. There's smaller turbines, and there are certainly people who've had exactly the same range of symptoms related to those turbines.
Well, doesn't that then make the point that Simon Chapman's making?
No, I don't agree with that at all. I think Simon is inferring that, in fact, the publicity about these problems is then leading people to believe that they're getting sick, or, in other words, inferring that people like me are scaremongering. When you actually look at the evidence, Dr. David Iser was one of the first GP, in fact he was the first GP in Australia, the second GP in the world to actually do a study of his own patients who he
an
knew
unpublished study
back in 2003, and he recorded what happened to those people after the wind turbines started operating. Same thing with Dr. Amanda Harry in the UK. Now these people knew their patients. What happened was that the wind turbines moved in, and they noticed that their patients were starting to get a unique and characteristic range of symptoms which hadn't been described in the medical literature. Both of them lived in areas where they were the only medical practice around, and so they started recording the symptoms and did their study. What's happened elsewhere is that there have been problems, but because the people, for example, in Marlborough, go to many other different doctors in Ballarat and the surrounding areas, each doctor would only see maybe 1, 2 or 3 cases, and so they don't necessarily pick up that this is actually what's going on, whereas David Iser and Amanda Harry had the unique situation of being the GPs looking after that population group. So they saw many more of these patients. I mean, this is essentially something that's new to medicine but not new to the acousticians who've described this for some years.
Simon Chapman?
Well, I was over in New Zealand a couple of months ago presenting at a conference, a wind energy conference, and there were some people there from Europe, and they said, this is astonishing, what we're hearing about what's going on in Australia here. We have never encountered this problem in Europe, and I've lived in Europe myself, in France, and anyone who's been to Europe will see wind turbines all over the place. There are millions and millions of people who are living adjacent to wind turbines in Europe who are seemingly unaffected to this, and the other interesting issue that I find, if Sarah Laurie is so worried about infrasound, then she ought to go down to the coast and start measuring infrasound on the coast inside people's houses, because one of the biggest sources of infrasound that people are exposed to is infrasound generated by the sea. It's also generated by ceiling fans, by subwoofers, by refrigerators.
There's on the same level?
That's one of the interesting things. If you go into a house and start measuring infrasound, you'll get a reading from it. and it's all stuff mixed up. It's from a whole lot of different sources. So how is Sarah going to propose that it's just from the wind turbines that's causing this?
Well, Simon, actually, I'm not proposing it because I am not an acoustician, and I'm not aware either that you've got acoustics training, and I'm also unaware that you actually have a medical degree.
Well, I'm not aware that you've published a single research paper, Sarah,
no,
or that you're even registered or as a doctor at the moment.
I'm proposing that the research gets done. I've been advocating for research all the way along, and I'm delighted that there are independent acousticians who, that's their specialty, who are out there measuring wind turbine noise, and they're finding that there is indeed a very unique sound signature that comes from the turbines, and that is in the homes of people who are getting sick.
Okay, so let me pick up that point because we are running out of time. I just want to wrap it up with one point, Simon, that I guess is related to that. I mentioned before the National Health and Medical Research Council said there is no published scientific evidence to support adverse effects of wind turbines on health. But they also went on and said that the evidence that we do have is limited and that relevant authorities considering whether to approve wind farms should take a precautionary approach, which suggests that there might be something to this that's not just anecdotal. I mean, do you accept that there is a paucity of evidence?
Well, there have been 17 reviews of the evidence published. The first one came out in 2003, and the last ones came out last year. When the NHMRC puts out its next report, which we're expecting by the end of the year, this will be the 18th report. Now, all of those reports, which I've got links to on my website, and with extracts from what they've concluded, all of them, including in reports by the British Health Protection Agency. These are totally independent organisations. They're not wind industry organisations or anything like that. They're saying that the evidence is not there. So, I'm sure
but are they saying we need more?
Look, no one in science will ever say about any... I mean, my main area of research is tobacco control. I would never say we don't need any more research about smoking and health. But what I would say is that we have an amazing amount of evidence that it's harmful. And I think what people who've looked at this in wind farms are saying is that we've got evidence that it's almost certainly not harmful. When do we get to a point where we draw a line?
That's not correct, Simon. And I think you need to remember that Professor Anderson, in his evidence to the Senate, said that an absence of evidence does not mean that there's not a problem. We need to actually start.
Well, how many reviews do you want, Sarah?
Of human safety data and dose response curves relating to wind turbine noise on adjacent populations.
Okay, I'm going to draw a line under it because we do have to move on. I think we've identified the contours of the debate at the very least. So I think that's actually quite an achievement. It's a good thing that we managed to do that today. We'll no doubt pick up the discussion in subsequent weeks and months. So I thank both of you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Wally.
Thank you, Wally.
Dr. Sarah Laurie, Chief Executive Officer of the Waubra Foundation, an organisation concerned with the health impacts of wind turbines. Professor Simon Chapman, Professor of Public Health at the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney. Our Tuesday panel here on RN Drive.